If God uses a murder to save the world, who is responsible for the crime? The killer or the creator who knew exactly where that crime would lead? That's not just a philosophical puzzle, it's a problem sitting inside some of the darkest stories in the Bible. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. The adversary is permitted to destroy almost everything Job loves, and Jesus is betrayed, condemned, and executed. In all three stories, evil appears to succeed. But then the Bible makes the disturbing claim that forces us to look again. What evil intended for destruction somehow became entangled with the very outcome it was trying to prevent. And by the third story, that paradox becomes almost impossible to ignore, because the worst act in the story becomes central to the rescue. So does that mean God actually uses evil? And if he does that make him responsible for it? Keep that question in mind, because the answer gets more uncomfortable with every story. Joseph sees his brothers in the distance, but before he reaches them, they've already decided what they want to do. Genesis says, "Here comes this dreamer." Then they begin discussing his death. Think about the irony of those words. They hate Joseph partly because of his dreams in which his family bow before him. So their solution is simple: destroy the dreamer and you destroy the dream. Joseph arrives, his brothers seize him, they strip away the special robe their father gave him, they throw him into a pit, and then Genesis includes one chilling little detail: they sit down to eat. Joseph is trapped nearby while his brothers have a meal. Eventually, Judah proposes something that sounds less violent, but is hardly merciful. Don't kill him, sell him. A caravan is traveling toward Egypt, so Joseph is pulled from the pit and sold. His brothers take his robe, cover it with animal blood, and allow their father to believe Joseph is dead. At this point, forget how the story ends. Don't picture Pharaoh, don't picture the palace, don't picture Joseph storing grain. Freeze the story here. The brothers have won. Joseph's dreams appear finished. He's lost his family, he's lost his freedom, he's being carried toward a foreign country as property. And yet there is one detail their brothers cannot possibly understand. They are sending Joseph exactly where the story needs him to go. Not because they're secretly cooperating with God, they're not. Their hatred is real, their betrayal is real, and Joseph's suffering is about to get worse. In Egypt, Joseph serves in Potiphar's house. Then he's falsely accused, then imprisoned, then forgotten. So even after the betrayal moves him toward Egypt, there is no immediate sign that anything good is happening. That's important because sometimes we retell Joseph's story so quickly that the pit feels like a minor inconvenience on the way to the palace. It wasn't. Joseph spends years living inside consequences created by other people's evil. But eventually, Pharaoh has dreams no one can interpret. Joseph is brought out of prison. He warns Pharaoh of 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. And Pharaoh elevates the former slave to extraordinary authority. Then the famine comes. It spreads beyond Egypt, and eventually Joseph's brothers arrive looking for food. The men who sold Joseph into Egypt now depend on Joseph in Egypt to survive, and the dream they tried to prevent begins unfolding in front of them. But Genesis doesn't leave us to guess what Joseph thinks all of this means. Near the end of the story, after Jacob dies, the brothers fear Joseph will finally take revenge. Instead, Joseph says something astonishing: "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Notice the wording. Joseph doesn't say, "What you did was secretly good." He calls it evil. Their intention remains wicked, but somehow the same event carries another intention toward another outcome. They meant to remove Joseph. God used what they did to position Joseph where lives would eventually be preserved. The brothers tried to destroy the dream, and their attempt became part of the road toward its fulfillment. That is our first disturbing pattern. But Joseph eventually receives something our next man never does. Joseph gets to look backward and see what the pit led to. Job doesn't get that luxury. And if this is why you watch Verse Unseen, not just for familiar Bible stories, but for the uncomfortable details hiding inside them, subscribe. Because Joseph's story is actually the easiest of these three. He eventually sees the outcome. The next story asks something much harder. What happens when evil asks for permission to destroy an innocent man's life, and God permits the test? The book of Job begins by telling us something Job himself doesn't know. Job is described as blameless and upright. He fears God and turns away from evil. Then the scene changes. The adversary appears before God, and he challenges the reason for Job's faithfulness. Does Job fear God for nothing? Look at everything Job has: family, wealth, protection, blessing. The accusation is essentially this: Job doesn't love you, Job loves what you give him. Remove the gifts, and he'll turn against the giver. Then comes the part that makes this book so uncomfortable. God permits the adversary to test Job within limits. And Job knows none of this. He doesn't hear the accusation. He doesn't know he's at the center of a challenge. From Job's perspective, his world simply begins collapsing. His wealth disappears. Servants are killed. And then comes the loss that makes every easy explanation of this story feel inadequate. His children die. Job grieves, but he does not curse God. So the test intensifies. His health is struck. He sits among ashes, scraping his sores. His wife sees what remains of his life and asks why he still holds on to his integrity. Then Job's friends arrive, and at first they do perhaps the wisest thing they do in the entire book: nothing. They sit with him for 7 days because his grief is too great for words. Then Job speaks. And if you expect the Bible to give us a smiling hero who calmly says, "God has a plan," Job is not that book. Job wishes he had never been born. He questions, he protests, he demands an answer. His friends respond with increasingly confident explanations. Surely this happened because Job did something wrong. Surely suffering this severe must mean guilt. But you, the reader, know something they don't. The book already told you Job was upright, so their neat explanation collapses. And now something strange happens between you and Job. You know why the test began. Job didn't. You saw chapters 1 and 2. Job didn't. Which means every time Job asks why, the reader is sitting there holding information the suffering man himself never receives. And that creates an enormous open question. Surely when God finally speaks, he will explain everything. Surely Job will learn about the adversary. Surely God will tell him why this happened. Except he doesn't. When God finally answers Job, he speaks from the whirlwind, but he doesn't give Job the behind-the-scenes replay we received. Instead, God confronts Job with questions about creation. Where were you when the earth's foundations were laid? Can you command the morning? Can you comprehend the dimensions of creation? The answer Job receives is not a tidy explanation of each tragedy. It's an encounter with the limits of his own perspective. Job discovers that reality is vastly larger than what he can see from inside his suffering. Eventually, his fortunes are restored, but we should be careful with that ending. The restoration doesn't retroactively make his suffering pleasant, and new children don't make the children who died meaningless. The book refuses that kind of arithmetic. So what happened to the adversary's accusation? Remember the claim, "Take everything away and Job will curse God." Job loses almost everything. He grieves, he argues, he questions God fiercely, but the predicted collapse never happens. The adversary is permitted to act, the destruction is real, the suffering is real, yet the accusation does not achieve its ultimate goal. That's our second pattern. Joseph shows us evil intentions being redirected toward an outcome the perpetrators never wanted. Job shows us destructive action operating within limits and still failing to produce the final result it predicted. But there's something both stories still have in common. The central man survives. Joseph survives the pit. Job survives the test. The third man doesn't, at least not by Friday night. For a moment, forget that you know the ending. Erase Easter Sunday from your memory. Erase the empty tomb. Erase 2,000 years of Christianity. Stand outside Jerusalem on Friday afternoon. Jesus has been betrayed. His followers have scattered. His enemies have succeeded. And now he's hanging dead on a Roman cross. If that's all you can see, what exactly would make you think God's plan is working? Because from the ground, it looks like evil has finally won. Everything converges on Jesus at once. One of his own disciples betrays him. Judas takes the silver. Jesus is arrested. False testimony is brought against him. Peter denies knowing him. Political pressure builds. Pilate gives the order. Jesus is mocked, beaten,
and crucified. Look at the event only through human motives. Judas betrays. Religious leaders want Jesus removed. Political authority chooses execution. Soldiers carry it out. These are not people thinking, let's accomplish God's redemptive purpose. They're acting for their own reasons. And yet the New Testament refuses to describe the cross as an accident that God desperately repaired afterwards. Peter says something startling in Acts chapter 2.
He describes Jesus as being delivered up according to God's definite plan and foreknowledge, and in the same breath holds the people who crucified him responsible. Then Acts chapter 4 goes even further. The believers speak about Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, the peoples of Israel, all gathered against Jesus. Real people, real decisions, real responsibility. And yet the prayer says they did what God's hand and plan had determined beforehand would take place. Now, the paradox is unavoidable. How can an event be genuinely wicked, carried out by morally responsible people, and still fall within God's purpose? That's the question underneath this entire video. And the crucifixion intensifies it because Christianity doesn't merely say God brought something good after Jesus' death. It says the death itself becomes central to redemption. The instrument of execution becomes the symbol of salvation. The place that looks like God's defeat becomes the place Christians say sin is confronted. And then Paul gives us one more strange clue. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he speaks about God's hidden wisdom. Then he says that the rulers of this age did not understand it, because if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Read that slowly. They would not have done it if they had understood. That means the act they believed would remove Jesus was accomplishing something they did not comprehend. Imagine darkness staring at the cross. Jesus appears defeated. The disciples have scattered. The movement looks finished. From that perspective, the cross looks like victory. But behind that apparent victory is something the enemy does not control, a tomb that will not remain occupied. The evil involved in the crucifixion does not become good. Betrayal remains betrayal. Injustice remains injustice. Murder does not become righteousness simply because God brings redemption through it. But the intended outcome is reversed. The attempt to eliminate Jesus becomes central to the message that spreads his name throughout the world. The cross designed to shame him becomes the symbol carried by his followers. Death appears to win on Friday, and then comes Sunday. Which brings us back to the disturbing question we started with. If God knew, if God permitted, and if Scripture can even describe some of these events as falling within his purpose, then where exactly does responsibility actually belong? There's an easy answer here, and it's the wrong one. You could say, if God uses evil for his purposes, then maybe evil isn't really evil. But Scripture never gives us that escape. Joseph doesn't tell his brothers, you thought you were evil, but actually you were doing good. He says, you meant evil. Their moral responsibility remains. Job's suffering isn't treated as imaginary simply because the reader knows there's a larger conflict. Job is allowed to grieve, to question, to lament. And the people involved in Jesus' death aren't suddenly called righteous because the crucifixion becomes central to salvation. Acts can hold two ideas together that we often want to separate. God has a purpose. Humans remain responsible. That's the tension. God's sovereignty doesn't transform villains into heroes. It means wickedness cannot guarantee the ending at once. And now the three stories suddenly line up. Joseph's brothers wanted the dreamer gone. Their betrayal sent him toward Egypt. The adversary predicted Job would abandon God. The suffering came. The prediction failed. The people who wanted Jesus eliminated succeeded in getting him crucified, and Christianity says that very cross became central to their own need for salvation. 3 acts of darkness, 3 apparent victories, and 3 reminders that accomplishing an evil act is not the same as controlling what God can ultimately do through it. Evil can win a moment without owning the ending. But even that sentence needs a warning,
Because these stories do not give us permission to look at every tragedy and confidently announce God did this because he needed something good to happen. Joseph could interpret his story because the biblical text gives us that interpretation. Job warns us against pretending we know why another person suffers, and the crucifixion has an explicit redemptive meaning within the New Testament. Those are very different from us inventing explanations for tragedies Scripture has not explained. Sometimes faith means seeing the outcome. Joseph did. Sometimes it means never receiving the explanation you wanted. Job didn't. And sometimes the thing that looks like the destruction of God's plan turns out to be sitting at the very center of it all. The disciples learned that at the cross. And that leaves us with the hardest question of all. If God's purposes can include actions committed by people who oppose him, where exactly is the line between God permitting evil, God using evil, and God willing that an event occur? Those phrases sound similar, but theologically they can mean very different things. And how you answer that question changes how you understand sovereignty, human freedom, suffering, prayer, and even the cross itself. So I want your answer before we explore that distinction. Can evil happen outside God's plan? Tell me what you think in the comments. And don't just answer yes or no, tell me why. Because the Bible's answer may be far more unsettling than either side expects.